So, Ethan, today we're diving into this world of memory and memorization. And while we might not go as deep as exploring the memory palace technique used by Sherlock Holmes, still, I believe that the methods that you will be sharing today are those surefire ways to remember new English words better and faster. Before we get into that and you give us a glimpse of all those tips you brought today, I want to ask you, have you ever heard of such technique as a pillow method?
I have not heard of the pillow method.
I coined this term just right now. So whenever we had to memorize a poem, back in middle school, so we were learning poems by heart, I would write it on a sheet of paper, read it multiple times, and then right before going to bed, I would put that paper under the pillow. And it was believed, I wasn't the only one, it was just the method of the half of our group. So it was believed that by morning, you would know the poem by heart. As simple as that.
By osmosis, maybe.
I don't know, that was so silly, but I just blindly believed that, or just not believed that. No, I believe I did it, just in case. Okay, maybe it doesn't work, but what if? This eternal what if,
By the way, Ksenia, you used some really nice expressions here already. I took note of a bunch of them. So you said a surefire way. What does it mean if something is a surefire way?
I'm not sure where it comes from, but this means actually that this is a very effective method. It will work 100%.
And you mentioned glimpse, to get a glimpse at something.
Mm-hmm. A glimpse is just like a short view. So you're looking very quickly at something. So before going deeper into some topic or into all those methods, explaining them, you will just give a glimpse of what they are.
And there were a couple other expressions. You said by heart, by osmosis, I also said. And if you are not listening to this podcast or watching it on the Real Life English app, then I highly recommend that you check it out because you get vocabulary flashcards for all of the most advanced expressions like these that we've already been using, which are going to help you to never forget them. And that's exactly why you're here today, because you want to improve your memory. So that's one surefire way to do it, is by starting to listen to these lessons on the Real Life English app. So you can check that out for free by clicking the link down in the description below, or by searching for Real Life English in your favorite app store.
Oh yeah, so Ethan, don't make us wait any longer. Could you please share the list of those tips with us?
Yeah, so there might be more, but I took note of 7 that I've used on my own journey. I've learned 6 foreign languages, and I don't still speak all of these, but in order to learn different languages, you come across things that work and don't work so well. And I wanted to share things that might be more novel for people, more surprising, or things that you haven't heard already in other videos, or that might not be something that is obvious or that you've thought of yourself. So for example, I think that the most obvious way is by, as soon as you learn a word, something I try to do myself is try to sneak that into a conversation when I get the chance to speak. So I'm trying to think of things that were a bit more outside of the box than that. So the first one is starting with correct sounds. Then we have using SRS. Third is avoiding translation. Fourth is engaging your senses. Fifth is reading. Sixth is learning collocations. And the last one is learning with polyglots.
Ooh, polyglots. I remember that's one of my first encounters with English again when I came back to it after some 10 years break with English. I came across a polyglots channel called 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗶𝗪𝗟𝗶 or something like that. And I got hooked
I know him, yeah.
again to English because of his videos. But let me ask you this.
He has incredible English. He's from Italy, but he sounds like an American, right?
And he speaks 9, or I don't remember now, but he speaks several languages fluently. You use this phrasal verb to sneak something in. Could you define it, please?
Well, actually, I was saying that that's more of an obvious one, is use it right away as soon as you learn it. So that won't be one of the tactics, but it is kind of like a maybe 0.5 tactic. if you sneak something in, you put it in some place in a subtle way without people knowing. So, for example, if you really want to go to a concert and you don't have a ticket, you might try to sneak in to go in without the security guard seeing you. Or something that parents might do. I don't know if you have to do this with Mira, but maybe you sneak in vegetables into her diet by, blending it into her favorite kind of soup.
Used to do it a lot before. Now she's too grown up for that.
She's too wise.
Learned her lessons. Anyway, let's start with the first one. Could you tell us more about this first method, which remind me, what was that, the first one?
So that was start with correct sounds. And this I've borrowed from other polyglots like Idahosa Ness and Gabriel Wyner, who are both people that I've personally interviewed. If you go on the RealLife English app, we actually have those interviews on there. So it's the only place where you can listen to the full interviews. So you might check those out because they have phenomenal tips for learning languages. But most people are too focused on reading, on learning words just by seeing them on paper and so on. But the problem with this is that we tend to learn the wrong pronunciation. So when we get the chance to speak them, on the one hand, we say them incorrectly. On the other hand, they also don't stick with us as well, because when we're learning another language, it tends to have foreign sounds, and things that sound foreign to us, they don't stick in our brain as well, because there's like a, any of us have heard that, like probably if I were to try to teach you some word in Mandarin, right, that has a lot of sounds that don't exist in English or Ukrainian, for you, you're going to forget it after 10 seconds because it just doesn't stick into your brain. So I think that this is something that can make a humongous difference in your ability to start saying English words as being less foreign and just naturally sticking with you more.
Mm-hmm. I love the word humongous. It's just like this extra large, extra big, emphasizing how big it is, humongous. You mentioned Gabriel Wyner. We invited him on our channel, Beyond Borders show, where you interviewed him. And around that period, I read his book, Fluent Forever. And now I'm not sure if that came from this book or not, but some surprising fact I learned about sounds, because he also tells exactly that we should start learning first listening to the language. Again, I'm sorry if that's not coming from there. Let's imagine that Gabriel Wyner says that actually there are around 800 sounds of human language exist in the world, and each separate language only takes around 40 of them, right? So
that sounds about right.
Yeah, and it was so interesting for me. And actually, if you imagine that you listen to those foreign sounds, you can pick them up. So the language doesn't sound so foreign, as you said, when you come to learning individual words, right?
It made me think of that we have to go with Jordy to the US to visit my family, of course. And he has really good English, but he does use some of the sounds from Catalan when he speaks English. So one example I thought of that I could give, because I've seen this, like when he's talking to my family or when he's talking to friends of mine and so on from there, that sometimes they'll misunderstand because they heard a different word. So in Catalan, for example, when you have a word ending in D or T, they both take the T sound. And in English, they have separate sounds. So sometimes, for example, with words like card and cart, if he's not thinking about it enough, he might say the same thing. So instead of saying, do you like to play cards? He'd say, do you like to play carts?
Oh,
and
okay.
Especially someone, if they don't speak another language, if they're not thinking about it too much, they might think, do you like to play carts like Mario Kart? Or what do you mean?
Yeah.
So it can cause different misunderstandings. This is one reason why it's really important to get those sounds right. And I'm guessing maybe people might want to know, okay, this is great, start with the sounds and correct pronunciation, but how do I do that, right? So nowadays a resource I would use, you can Google this, of course, but I think it's even easier to use AI, to use ChatGPT and ask what sounds exist in English that don't exist and put in your native tongue. So you might say, what sounds exist in English that don't exist in Ukrainian? And it should give you a list of all of the individual sounds that exist. Then I think you have to be a bit more creative. If I had a lot of time, I would, and this will be the next tactic we're going to talk about, using SRS, but I would use some sort of SRS to create flashcards where on one side I would have the sound, and on the other side I would have the word. So you would do this for like minimal pairs, which are words like ship, sheep, or cot and cat that are almost the same except for one sound. So you would have a minimal pair for each of these sounds. You would create this flashcard and you test yourself. When you hear it, it's like, okay, cot, cat. You hear cot. You have to guess, is it cat or is it cot that I just heard? By doing this over and over again, you're going to start, even though one of those sounds doesn't exist in your language, you'll start to be able to hear it. And then once you can hear it correctly, once you can correctly identify that every single time, you'll also be able to start producing it yourself. Because basically the reason why we mispronounce things is when that sound doesn't exist in our native language, is that we don't even know how to produce it. Because obviously if you don't know that sound exists, if you can't hear the difference, you're not going to be able to make the different sound yourself, right?
So listening to the sounds should take like a bigger part at the very beginning. But we're recording the podcast not for the beginners of English. Maybe they decide to pick up another language. That would be a very valuable tip for them. And now I'm curious to think about this SRS, which sounds like SOS. How far is it from SOS? Can it also help you?
And I'd also just comment on what you were just saying. I think it's never too late. It's maybe a little bit more challenging because you have fossilized mistakes, which are mistakes that you've been doing them for a long time, so they sort of become a part of how you use the language. But you can correct those fossilized mistakes through repetition. So even if you've been learning English for a long time and you have mispronunciations and so on, you can correct those.
Yeah, but especially, for example, when you get frustrated that you know that you speak English confidently, you know lots of vocabulary, you have no issues like freezing up or something, but you come across this thing that people don't understand you. Yeah, so that's the point exactly for even not beginners of English to come back to the drawing board and start with the pronunciation, right?
That's the expression. What does that mean, to come back to the drawing board?
That means to start all over, start the project or process from the very beginning.
So the next tactic, Ksenia, is using SRS, and SRS stands for Spaced Repetition Software. Basically what this means is that it's a technology that works with how your memory works. So we probably all have had this experience that when we first hear a word, it leaves our brain almost instantly, especially if you haven't started with the correct sounds and it has foreign sounds in it, it's going to leave just a few minutes later even. But we've also all had the experience probably of having something become a part of our long-term memory. And there's certain words that you know in a second language, in English, for example, that will never leave your brain. They're a part of your permanent vocabulary. So how do you go from being that short-term memory that leaves very quickly to long-term memory? And it's through doing the spaced repetition technique. So at the beginning, you need to see, for example, a new word or expression more often because you are still forming that memory. But over time, it becomes more and more a part of your long-term memory, and so you can space it out more. So at the beginning, maybe you need to see it a few minutes after you first heard it, then a few hours, then a day, and then a few days, and then weeks, and then months, and so on until you'll never forget that word or expression. So this technology, if you're not using it already, it's very, very valuable for language learners to be able to deliberately form new memories. And that's exactly what we use on the RealLife English app, right? For our flashcards, we have the spaced repetition software so that 30 or more words in every single one of the podcasts that you're learning, you will make sure that you're never, ever forgetting.
But let me ask you, because I'm not sure if for all the people it would be understandable, easy to understand why it's called spaced repetition. You use this phrasal verb to space things out, to space these words out. Could you explain a little bit more what exactly it is?
Yeah, so it's spaced repetition, or spacing it out means that you're putting space between it. That space keeps getting larger and larger as it becomes more part of your long-term memory. That's how I kind of learned languages. I didn't even use flashcards. Like I used to, when I was learning German, I carried around a small notebook in my pocket and I could write down new words, but there wasn't any rhyme or reason to how I was learning these. I was just like, from time to time would review the new words that I had and stuff, but I had it all mixed up with the words that were already, I knew pretty clearly, and other ones that were newer. So I wasn't using that technique of spaced repetition. And then, I remember learning Spanish in university. It was just memorizing lists, like rote memorization.
That's what we
where
did.
You're just trying to like look at it over and over again and get it in. So spaced repetition is millions of times more effective than these old-fashioned techniques.
When did you first use the spaced repetition system?
Yeah, so actually I learned about it when I moved to Brazil, and it was through Anki, which I think is kind of like the OG SRS tool, which is like a very simple one, but it worked really well.
OG?
Yeah. OG means the original gangster. So it's like the first one that was really popular amongst students, used a lot for all sorts of different subjects, but for language learners as well.
So it's like a better way to say about some old-fashioned things, something that was at the very beginning, maybe basic, or like
it's kind of slang.
Pioneering, maybe, right?
And I believe we actually have the Learner of the Week that was talking about how our flashcards have been very valuable for them in their language learning, right?
They were talking about this practice center. Exactly. If you go to the RealLife English app and click on practice, you will find those flashcards there. So let me read what this student wrote to us. So we got this email from Ananthu, and they write, I love this application. I have been using this kind of app for a while, but the difference I noticed is the lesson and vocabulary session you guys provide to us. I reached out to this app with an impression of a speaking practice app. I needed only that at that time, but the practice session was eye-opening for me. I'm grateful to you guys for making this beyond a speaking practice app. So I'm so glad that Ananthu opened different features of our app, right? It's not only about speaking, which is also great to put into practice everything that you learn, but it also has this actual practice, this actual spaced repetition system, right? For learning those words.
Right. And that's going to, all these tactics too that we're talking about today, they build on top of each other. So if you're using the spaced repetition, which also some of the other tactics we'll talk about there included in those, and then you go and have a conversation with someone, which you can do anytime, anywhere, you can try to sneak in, as I said earlier, sneak in these new words or new expressions into the conversation. So being deliberate about trying to actually use those, and that also will help to make it more of a long-term memory.
You just mentioned now and at the very beginning the term long-term and short-term memory, right? And it reminded me of the movie Finding Nemo. Have you watched this movie? And do you remember Dory?
Of course.
Yeah.
It's a classic.
Yeah. And Dory was suffering. Yeah. Or she suffered. Dory suffered from short-term memory loss. And do you remember one of the methods she actually used? She was repeating this address over and over again because she knew this is something important. She can't forget it. So she was just repeating this address over and over again.
P. Sherman 42 Wallaby Way, Sydney. P. Sherman 42 Wallaby Way, Sydney. P. Sherman 42 Wallaby Way, Sydney.
To get it to go into her long-term memory, right?
Yeah, probably.
I guess.
And basically, there are like techniques how to do that, to bring things from your short-term memory into long-term memory. I would be happy to tell more about this because this weekend I just listened to this amazing podcast on this topic. I want to share it with you more in our digging part today.
All right. Well, the next couple of tactics that I have, Ksenia, they are also helping with this layering. They go really well with if you're using any spaced repetition software. So the first one is avoiding translation. So many people's first instinct when they start using flashcards like this is to put on one side the new word and put on the other side what that word is in their native language. I don't recommend this for when you're learning a language because it really perpetuates the bad habit that people have of translating in their head. And all of us know that we want to break out of translating in our head. We don't want to be in a conversation with someone and trying to think first of what do I want to say in my native language, and then, okay, how do I say that in English, and what's the correct grammar, and I can't think of that one word. So, it just kind of creates really, really choppy communication when you do get the opportunity to speak.
What kind of communication is choppy? Could you define it?
Yeah, we might chop vegetables, right? So when communication is choppy, it's kind of like it's cut up. It's not fluent. It's not fluid like we want our communication to be. So by already getting in the habit of using, instead of translation, looking up the definition in English. So you come across a new word like choppy, and you look up in an English dictionary, the word choppy, and it will have the definition in English, and you use that. And using images also is really helpful here. So especially if it's something that, is an object or something that you can picture, is like looking up that word or that expression on Google Images and using an image that you find there that, that image really stood out to you for that word. And that goes to the next one, the next tactic, which is engaging your senses. So using images helps to engage your sight. But the thing about memory is it's a lot like velcro. You know what velcro is?
This is like when you fasten your, right? How you say that when you have a sweater or
that
like,
a zipper?
Like a zipper, yeah.
It's usually
I now I got
a black
it.
material.
Yeah, this like with those little
Actually,
hooks.
I have it like on my watch, right?
Mm-hmm,
like this, it makes this noise, right? So I don't know if you've ever looked at it closely, but Velcro, it has these little hooks and like little loops. That's how it works basically, is because when you put it together, the hooks go into the loops. So memory is a lot like that if it's a weak memory, it's going to be like you have the loops, but you don't have very many hooks. So it's not going to be very effective at sticking together. The best Velcro has like the tiniest loops and hooks and, probably thousands or millions of them so that it really sticks together well when you put it together. And using your senses is like in a Velcro, like adding a bunch of more hooks. We want memories to have as many hooks as possible. So having an image that really stands out to you, that's one way. But, how could you maybe involve smell or taste? Or one that I know is really big for me is location. Like I used to go running and I would listen to podcasts, for example, when I was learning Catalan, I used to listen to a lot of podcasts in Catalan. So I can still remember words that I learned while I was running in a certain place. It's really weird, but it's like I think of that word and I think of the place where I was when I learned it. And, maybe you could add things like smell or taste by learning vocabulary while you're having a special breakfast, or maybe you're sitting in a cafe and you're having one of your favorite treats, or maybe the smell because you're doing it while you're having your morning coffee. And it's just like it really sticks together with that smell of your favorite Colombian roast.
Create a special space for learning English and like surround yourself with those things you enjoy so that it brought you also emotion, because I think I'm not sure if you're going to talk about emotions, because like another part of it, like all these associations and triggering your senses, is making it personal to you through emotions, right? Like adding emotions to the learning process. And that's why sometimes we remember better what we did for the very first time, or we remember how we can learn from our mistakes. If we made a mistake and it made us feel embarrassed, we also remember it just because it added emotion to it, right? Like, for example, the other day, do you remember I was telling you about cutting my toe, right? And I used the word thumb, and you like was puzzled for a moment because thumb is this big finger on your hand. And I meant to say toe, a big toe on my foot, but I used the wrong word, and you corrected me, and then like, or not corrected, you just like asked, was it a thumb? I hope you weren't
too embarrassed.
No, but I wasn't that embarrassed, but it was like, I felt silly. Oh my God, yeah, it wasn't the thumb, it was a toe. So now every time I say that, like I remember this situation.
Yeah, that's strong because it has like probably pain that is associated with it, right? Mm-hmm. Those kind of things are really powerful. And even capturing those, if you're creating these SRS cards, for example, can you add on there the context where you first saw this word? Or even, you might even add things on there like, oh, I learned this word while I was sitting at a cafe, or I learned this word while I was with my friend Javi, or, whatever the case was. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And even using, this will help to connect to the next tactic, but even using the media that you're watching, because I know that sticks for me really well too, is a certain word that I learned in a certain series, and I remember very well this one scene that I was watching that I heard the character use this word. Like that really sticks with me as well. So you might think about how you can capture it while you are living your English. The next tip relating to living your English is reading. Mm-hmm. So reading is probably the best way to acquire advanced vocabulary. So this is especially for those of you that are watching or listening. Most of you, I think, are understanding us, are already at intermediate to upper intermediate level, and you're wanting to get to a more advanced level. So because when we're just speaking, we tend to use very limited vocabulary when we write. when you're reading a novel, for example, when you're reading a news article. So read what you love. Of course, don't read a novel if you hate reading literature. Don't read news articles if you hate reading the news in your native language even. But the written word, as we say, tends to have much deeper vocabulary. So vocabulary that is more advanced, it's more formal, it's more literary. And these are the things that really help to push you from being intermediate, stretching out of that to become an advanced learner.
Exactly.
So I personally like to do this by reading some fiction before bed. But depending, I'd say like engage with what you already enjoy.
Do you remember, or I don't know, did you count how many books in different languages you read? I mean, like not the amount of books, but how many different languages?
Yeah. My first experience, I read the last Harry Potter book in German. Actually, technically, I read part of The Little Prince in German, but I'd say the first one I completed was that. And then I read in Spanish. I've read in Spanish many books. I've read in Catalan many books. I read The Little Prince again in French.
In the original, right?
And Portuguese, I'm reading a book right now, but I've read several books in Portuguese. So I think in those, how many was that?
5?
German, Spanish,
Catalan, French,
Catalan, and Portuguese. Yeah, in 5 languages I've read books.
Is there any words that you remember that it comes from that book?
Varinha in Portuguese is like a wand, because I'm reading like something that's like it's not Harry Potter, but it's like inspired by the world of Harry Potter. Is like the wand, and there's like a lot of magical words like that I'm learning now through that. Now I think like chef d'oeuvre, which is like a masterpiece. I still remember that from The Little Prince.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure I can pronounce it.
I was just gonna say, along with reading too, because most people's first instinct, and this was my first instinct when I first started reading in German, was I would be like reading. Okay, I get like the first line, there's already a word I don't know, so I like look it up in the dictionary. This used to be, I think, with like I had like a pocket German dictionary. And then, okay, keep reading, 2 more sentences, another word, looking it up. And so it's just, then I'd like go back to the first sentence to like even remember what I'm reading about. Don't do that. What I highly recommend is like read, if you're into physical books, read with a pencil or pen and underline, or if you're on a Kindle, you can highlight, or any sort of e-reader, you can highlight. And then during your study time, then go and look up. And it's okay. You don't need to understand everything. That's the great thing about reading is, choose something that's like a little bit above your level. So you're challenging yourself, but you don't need to read Shakespeare or read something that's extremely advanced that you're not going to understand anything. But yeah, it's okay if you understand like 80%, because through the context, you should understand enough to be able to get the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
And another really great thing is that a lot of the words and expressions too, you'll just understand through the context. So you don't even need to look them up necessarily. Because of what's going on, you'll be able to deduce what does that mean. So it won't be with everything. But I've noticed that with a lot. And sometimes too, just by seeing the same word over and over again, I'm either like, okay, I need to look this up, or I start to already understand what it means. And I never actually need to study it on spaced repetition. So yeah, reading is a great resource.
Very good.
All right, so let's jump into the last 2 really quickly. So learn collocations. I don't want to go too deep into this because Izzy and I just recorded a whole podcast a few episodes ago all about collocations that I highly recommend people check out, because I think it goes hand in hand with what we're talking about today. You start making more mistakes when you do that, because you'll probably still be speaking like you would speak it in your native language. So one that comes to me very easily is that like in Spanish, Portuguese, you'll say that you think on something, but in English, it's actually think about something. So because people are just translating from, English, their native language to English, they then put it together with the preposition they'd use in their native language. And that doesn't work most of the time. So if you were learning with collocations, if you had instead on your flashcard, think about my weekend, then you would always be thinking that block, like think about my weekend, or think about my studies, or think about the weather, whatever it is. So I'd say always try to put together like an entire phrase on your flashcard, not just one individual word.
What I also like about this method when learning with collocation, because, English words, they are tricky. They may have different meanings. So by searching exactly, if you come back to reading, if you come across this word that you already know, but somehow the meaning of that word that you learned doesn't fit this very context, you can understand that, okay, then this word here is used in another meaning. So you write out another collocation for the same word, and now you know how to use it differently in another context.
Exactly. You start sort of mapping out the language in your mind, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
All right, and the last one was learning with polyglots. So you already said that, you did this with Luca, can't remember his last name.
I think it's
𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗶𝗀𝗟𝗶𝗚. And he's an incredible language learner. So the reason I say this is because most people who are watching or listening to this, I'm sure you have your favorite English teachers, and it's great learning with English teachers. We all have different experiences. Some, like Ksenia, that you've actually been successful already on your own learning English. Or like myself, that I've learned other languages, which helps. There's also some English teachers who they can be very good teachers, but maybe they've never actually been through the experience of learning a language themselves, so they might not have that empathy with your experience. But polyglots, they've themselves had to figure out how to learn various languages, so they've probably experimented a lot with all sorts of different techniques. This can be a really great way for you to get ideas of different things you can try, because everyone learns differently, right? And I think ultimately the way to become an advanced speaker and to become a really good learner is by experimenting and figuring out what works for you. So I've shared a lot of tactics today. You're going to need to try the different ones and see, like, what do you find is really effective for yourself? And by starting to watch videos from polyglots, for example, there's Gabriel, Wyner. We mentioned already Steve Kaufman. There's another one I like, Ollie Richards, Benny Lewis. There's tons of these people on YouTube and other places. And
this is so inspiring to watch those videos. You just like kind of, when you see that a person like, can speak fluently like eight languages, you understand that, okay, I can speak English at least, right? I can master English.
And I get jealous too. a tinge of jealousy.
Tinge of jealousy, exactly.
And because we're talking about polyglots, we can move on to today's kick-ass clip where we'll be looking at one polyglot who really blew me away.
Let's watch it.
All right, so this clip we're going to watch, it's with a polyglot. Her name is Elise, or maybe Elise. She's from France, but she speaks English at a native level. She also speaks Norwegian at a very advanced level. And this was just such an incredible video that I came across where she talks all about different ways that she was learning Norwegian. So I highly recommend you guys check out the whole thing down in the description below. What I want you to pay special attention to in the clips that we're going to watch together, and if you watch the whole video, is one way I'd put it is that she really acts like a scientist with the language. What do scientists do? They're really curious, and they really pull things apart. They really wanting to get into the nitty-gritty, into the details of whatever it is they're studying. So she is just so immensely curious about different aspects of the language, about the sounds, about different words, about how it all flows together, the music behind the language, and just about like how she can live the language, experiencing series and reading and so on. So let's check it out. And then I'd really recommend that you reflect a little bit about what of these things you can apply to your learning English.
And then I thought, kids don't do grammar exercises. They just don't. When I learned French, I didn't do, when I was 2 years old, grammar exercises with like sentences to fill in. No, I didn't do that. What I did was hearing, for example, the same book over and over again. And sometimes my mom, she tells me, like, when you were a kid, you knew one book by heart. You just like turned the pages. You knew exactly when the pages had to be turned, and you just turned it. And I thought, okay, this is how we learn when we're a kid. We read the same book over and over again, and then we take the expressions of the books and we make it our own. So I thought, okay, what I'm gonna do is find some scenes, for example, in a movie, or some messages that they send each other, in Scum. I watch Scum like so much. It's a TV series that's Norwegian, and in Scum they send each other a lot of messages, and some of them are pretty long, and I thought, okay, that's perfect. I'm gonna take a message that I like and I'm gonna write it down, and then I'm gonna just like try to understand the words, which word mean what, and then I'm gonna read it a lot of times. So what I did is that I used Google Translate, you can like make Google Translate read you things. Of course, it's a bit robotic.
Kjære Isak, nå sitter jeg der vi traff hverandre for første gang, og jeg tenker på deg.
It's really like a robot, but it does pronounce the words in the right way. And of course, what did help me is that I knew some people in Norway, so I could ask to record, for example, a message for me and to send me a vocal so that I could hear the melody of the language and try to like reproduce it when I was reading it. So this helped me a lot. I'd like to show you how I took notes for me to remember the pronunciation of words. So for example, I would write on top of the real word, like how I would have written it since it was pronounced that way. And also I could write like some arrows or some waves under the word to remember where the emphasis was put on the word.
Oh, I liked what she was telling about these kids, that they don't fill in the blanks. They don't do grammar exercises when learning a language. That was so funny. But also it reminded me of the reading methods that you were talking about. Yeah, by reading, learning vocabulary by reading. That's what she was doing as well. And what a neat idea to first listen to the audiobook, maybe. Like, let's say a chapter of an audiobook before you actually read it, to rely only on your ears, and then get an actual book and then read those words that you heard. Yeah, and then combine the two.
Yeah, and you asked me before about if there's words that have stuck with me, and just hearing her speaking, it reminded me that last year I listened to the audiobook of The Alchemist, but I listened to it in Portuguese, which is the original language. And I remember there was a part where, actually in several parts throughout the book, they kept talking about tamareiras, tamareiras. I was like, what is tamareiras? It was happening so many times, and it kind of like through the context, I couldn't really figure it out. It's like in a place and everything. And so I looked it up, and it's actually date trees, which if people don't know this, it happens in northern Africa. So there's oases where they're completely surrounded by these date trees. That's why she was always, or the narrator was always mentioning this place with the date trees and everything that you could see on the horizon in the desert. So I think like this kind of thing where, you know, it's just the repetition of it. And that's really how kids learn as well, is our parents reading to us. So audiobooks can be really nice as well, right?
Yeah, my mom said that I used to, you know, back in the day, we didn't have so many gadgets, so many technologies, but we had this thing for playing vinyl, right? Records. And I used to have many records with fairy tales. So I knew all of them by heart. And my mom like said that before going to school, I would recite those tales by heart just by listening to them.
I really like too what she was doing with Google Translate, because we talked about starting with the sound. And if you watch the full video, you'll see that that's something that she really obsessed over as well. And so I imagine, I haven't heard her speak Norwegian. Like I wouldn't be able to evaluate obviously her Norwegian accent, but I can see her English accent that it's incredible, like almost sounds like a native. So I think having that really scientific view of the pronunciation, of really digging into it, it's led her to have very, very native-like pronunciation. And that's something that you could do is, you know, also like we were talking about with the minimal pairs, is maybe having someone test you by playing the audio of one word or the other, one of the minimal pairs or the other, to see, can you pick out, you know, was that cot or was that cat? Was that ship or was that sheep? And so on.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. So we went through all those techniques. We watched the clip. I don't know if you want, as a bonus, to suggest now one example, choosing from all those techniques you shared, that our viewers could right now try and see if they can remember this word, like a challenge for all those who listened till this very part of the podcast.
Yeah, that's a really nice idea. So you mentioned at the beginning the word glimpse. So we talked about collocations, right? That you could just do the word glimpse, which is a small view of something, but it'd be much better to put a glimpse of something. So you know it's always glimpse of something. You're going to have the right word that goes along with it there. And you might listen also to the sound of this PS. That's kind of a weird combination, isn't it? The ps, glimpse, glimpse. That could be difficult, I imagine, for some learners. You could get a picture too to make it more visual for you, of maybe someone like looking through a small hole or something to try to get a small view of something. Can you think of anything else that maybe you could do to add more hooks to this word?
Yeah, I'm now thinking sometimes what helps me is to remember the letter, the beginning letter of the word. So here is like starts with G, but it's G sound. Yeah, G, L, then followed by L. So if it's like glimpse, then maybe I would, again, it's about vision, it's about looking at something. So maybe I would think about glasses. It also starts with GL. So I will stick this word glimpse to the word glasses to remember just
That's really nice.
how to start the word. Right?
All right, Ksenia, I'm really curious because you hinted earlier that you've been digging the Huberman podcast and that you had one that was very relevant to today's episode. So let's check out what you're digging.
So we will definitely link into the descriptions because this is the whole 1.5 hour podcast. So Andrew Huberman had as a guest Dr. Wendy Suzuki, who exactly specializes in how our brain works, how we retain those memories, how we transform them from a short-term into long-term memory. And from the very beginning of the podcast, so it's very valuable for you to at least listen to those first 15 minutes, she already enlists things that help us remember. And those things are, as always, they're just like very simple, and you may not believe it, but you know, she's a very serious scientist, so she knows what she's talking about. Those 4 simple things are novelty. I think I already told you from the very beginning. I still remember the first time when I tried to ride a 2-wheel bike. Yeah, when transitioning from a kid's bike with those like supporting, how do you call that in English? Supporting wheels?
Oh, yeah. The training wheels.
Training wheels. I still remember when I switched from this kid's bicycle into the 2-wheel bicycle. And this is exactly what helped me remember that day, like, you know, each moment of that day, because it was something novel, something new to me. Then repetition. We talked a lot about repetition. We even remembered Dory from Finding Nemo, right? So repetition is key. We always talk about this. There is no way to avoid that. Flashcards will be very helpful. Then association. It's funny that we mentioned all of those in our podcast today. Yeah, what she enlisted.
Of course, we're talking about memory.
So association is when you try to associate this word with something else. And finally, emotional resonance. When this word brings some emotion to you, it will always be easy for you to remember that. And how you can imply that in English is what we were suggesting you. Just like try to make the word your own. Try to use the words in your own sentences. Try to create some silly sentences. It is already an emotion, right? And when the combination of words sound a little bit silly, sometimes it's easy to remember, but remember about collocations. And then she also talked about these more serious things like hippocampus, but then exercising. Every morning she said that it's scientifically proved that you should exercise and use your muscles before you start using your brain. There is a real correlation between the two. And exposure to cold, right? I know that this is something Justin practices a lot. Yeah, there's ice baths. She says there are already like scientifically proved things that it really boosts our memory. And enough sleep.
I was going to say, I bet that it has a lot to do with each other. The cold exposure and the exercise, they both help with your sleep, with getting better quality sleep, and our memories are formed during sleep. So if you're sleeping less than 6 hours a night, you're not going to remember very well anything. So if you're not getting enough sleep, that's like really a big base for anything else we're talking about today is not going to help you if you're not getting enough sleep.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Like have enough sleep. And if we just recorded the lesson on Inside Out, and if you guys watched this lesson, you remember that when Riley went to bed, when she was sleeping, the emotions were transforming her memories of the day into her long-term memory during her sleep.
The final thing I wanted to note on before we end is you were talking about experience, and this just made me think about one thing I'm doing now is I started rowing like 2 months ago. So rowing out on the sea with a team and everything. I've been learning so many words. I have no idea what they are in English that are directly related to rowing. And it's using a lot of the things that you were talking about because it's very visual. So like I'm seeing different things. So like one word I could take, for example, is strop, which is like this thing that it's a woven ring that is used to attach the oar, the thing that you use to row, to the parts that I don't know what it's called that comes out of the side of the boat. And you know, I can see this thing, it's colorful, it has like a certain feel to it, so it's having that kind of emotional and sensual connections to it. And I'm getting memories because I'm also exercising at the same time, and I'm together with people, and I'm like learning this technique. So there's all of these hooks going into learning these words. So I just wanted to bring that up too, because if you can find ways to use your English outside of the classroom, that's what we say here, right? To learn other things that you enjoy. So take a music class, take an acting class, take something that you're interested, but in English, then you're just going to be opened up to so many possibilities of new vocabulary that you'll be encountering, but also things that will really stick with you just because of the whole experience that you're having there.
Oh, yeah. And I hope you guys are enjoying these lessons. You're listening to these podcasts, and the easy way to support us is to give us a 5-star review on any platform wherever you're listening. And if you are watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and hit the bell down below so you are notified every time we release a new lesson.
Also, guys, one of the best ways, as we've been saying in this podcast, to improve your memory, we take a lot of the work out of it for you by giving you vocabulary flashcards for every episode of this. So go listen on the Real Life English app, and you will not forget all the new words that you're learning in each episode. Possibly 30 new words a week, right?
That's right. And as always, no matter what divides us, that what unites us is far greater. 3, 2, 1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that success is something very personal. You know, for some people, it might be being the CEO of a company that makes millions of dollars every year. For other people, it might just be being a stay-at-home mom or dad that has your kids happy and healthy. But a lot of people just equate success with being rich and famous. So something I would really recommend to people is to actually take some time to reflect